Good morning from Seattle. It's morning here. I know it's the end of a long day for many of you, so I appreciate your willingness to stick around for this last talk. Topic of my talk is writing systems typology. This is an area in which linguists have been working for a long time and have generally set up typologies based on the spoken linguistic units that individual graphs of writing systems represent. But despite work that goes back over 100 years, we still have no definitive agreed upon typology within the field. And there are lots of different ways to set up a typology and to make fine-grained distinctions. Just to give you one example, this is Daniel's typology from 1996. In which he's expanded Gelb's classic three-way typology into a six-way typology, logosyllabary, syllabary, abjad, alphabet, abugida, featural system. I'm not going to talk about the details of these typologies and argue for which is more or less appropriate at this level of detail. I just wanted to give you an example of how complex and fine-grained they can get. I'm more interested in the broader question of how we can judge the validity of a typology and whether typologies like the one I just showed you reveal something insightful about how scripts function. Joyce and Borgwald, in the introduction to a volume on writing typology, say that typologies need to strike an appropriate balance between including too many types that may obscure important commonalities and only recognizing too few types that may mask deep insights about writing systems. And I'm interested in this idea of what a deep insight is. It seems to me that the goal of a typology should be to capture meaningful distinctions that can explain the behavior of scripts, that can generate useful hypotheses about their functions. In other words, that aren't just classificatory, but do some explanatory and predictive work. As I mentioned, there are lots of typologies out there and they vary in a lot of different ways. But nearly all of them recognize a basic bipartite distinction that has come up over and over again in the talks we've seen so far in this conference, and that is the distinction between logography and phonography. The idea being very simple, that logographic writing has graphs that represent meaningful units of language, such as words or morphemes, while phonographic writing has graphs that represent meaningless sound units of language, such as syllables. But even this basic distinction has been questioned. You'll remember from a talk yesterday that when we look at individual graphs, there's a question about whether they might be logographic or phonographic. It's not always resolvable. But even the distinction at the level of an entire writing system has been questioned. So in this talk, I want to explain why we question that. And then I want to provide what I think is some new kind of evidence to show that that distinction really does exist, and that it shows that this typological or categorical distinction is really a deep one in writing systems. And I'm going to start with some examples. It's common to say that Chinese writing is logographic, or specifically morphographic, with each graph representing a morpheme, and that English writing is phonographic, specifically of the alphabetic type, with each graph representing a phoneme. And it's easy to provide data that show that this is the case. Here are three modern Mandarin morphemes pronounced shi, meaning 10, stone, and eat. And as you can see, they are represented, even though homophonous, with three completely different graphs that share no structural properties in common. In contrast, here are three English morphemes that are also homophonous, and they are all written exactly the same way as we would expect in a phonographic system. But if we look at other data, it's not so clear-cut. So here are two other triplets of homophones. Here are fang, fang, and fang, three distinct morphemes in Mandarin. And if you look at them carefully, you will notice down here on the lower right, here on the right, and here on the right are a common element which is an indicator of the syllabic pronunciation. And if we look at the triplet in English, we have 3 homophones that are distinct morphemes, and they are all written differently, even though, as with the Chinese triplet, they also have some elements in common that are connected with the pronunciation. In addition, if we look at the level of individual graphs, we see that Chinese writing does employ some graphs as phonograms. For example, the 3 graphs that write Canada, meaning Canada, have only phonetic representation. And of course, as we know, English writing uses some logograms like the numeral 4 and the ampersand. So the question is an open one. Can we legitimately categorize an entire writing system and just say it is either logographic or phonographic? One of the people who argues that this is not possible is J. Marshall Unger, who has argued that all writing systems fall on a continuum, or if you like, on a gradient between pure phonography and pure logography, and none of the writing systems get close to either of these poles. So the idea is that although it would be possible to have a purely phonographic representation of language, something like International Phonetic Alphabet, and it's possible to have a purely logographic representation of language like a military secret code, all actual writing systems that are in use by people fall in a rather narrow band in between, and we can simply say that some are more or less logographic than others. And Unger says it's really a mistake to classify writing systems as one type or the other, because that obscures the way writing systems really work. Well, my claim is that there really are logographic writing systems, and there really is a categorical distinction, and that we need to look at how writing systems function in the real world. In other words, that functionality includes more than cognitive processing during the act of reading, and more than just counting up how many graphs represent morphemes or how many graphs contain a phonetic indicator within them. So when I think about how writing systems function, I think there are a lot of different ways that we can approach this question. We can ask, of course, how writing systems are processed by the brain during an activity like reading. We can ask how writing systems are taught, how they're learned, how they're memorized within a particular culture. We can talk about the physical processes of how they're actually written by humans holding implements. We can talk even about how writing systems are lexicographically arranged, how new written forms are created when they're needed, and how they are borrowed, which is the aspect I'm going to focus on today. And I think all of these are important and relevant questions. And a good typology of writing systems should help us gain insight into all of these questions. So I'm going to start with evidence from sonography, that is, from writing systems that use borrowed Chinese characters. In pre-modern Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, vernacular writing was sonographic, was done with borrowed Chinese characters. And as Yannis mentioned, my recent book in 2019 describes the processes by which this adaptation occurs. And I argue that these processes are universal. They're not limited to Chinese. The processes reveal characteristics of how writing systems function, and that the processes we see in script borrowing are a valid basis for script categorization. And why do I think that? Well, in part, as I'm going to show you, they correlate neatly with the traditional split between phonographic and logographic that linguists have posited on the basis of spoken units represented by graphs. The pathways of adaptation and of borrowing align with this phonographic logographic split that has been defined using other criteria. So let me show you what I mean by this. If we want to understand how Chinese characters have been adapted to write non-Chinese languages through history, the first thing we have to recognize is that Chinese characters have a sound and a meaning. They are conceptualized that way. This really isn't how we're supposed to think of them as linguists. We're supposed to think of Chinese characters as representing linguistic units, which in turn may have sound and meaning. But this is the way Chinese characters have been conceptualized for thousands of years by script users. It is the direct result of characters being logographic and writing words or morphemes that have sound and meaning. And we see it already in an early important Chinese dictionary, the Shuowenjiezi of 100 CE, in which over 9,000 characters are described in terms of their pronunciation and their meaning, as well as their graphic components. So this conceptualization of Chinese characters as having a sound and a meaning is fundamental to how Chinese writing is learned, how it's learned by Chinese speakers, how it's learned as a second language by non-Chinese speakers, and to how the script has been borrowed to write other languages. We can see this when we just think about the way that students of Chinese around the world today, who are not native speakers of Chinese, learn to read and write Chinese. How do they learn all of these Chinese characters? Well, the way they learn them, the way you've learned them if you've been a student of Chinese, is for each character, you look at the shape and you attempt to memorize an associated Chinese pronunciation and an associated meaning, which you would express in your own language. So as an English speaker, if I'm trying to learn this character, I would memorize that it's pronounced shi, and I would memorize that it means 10. Or for this character, second to the last, I would memorize that it's pronounced yue and that it means moon. And when I was learning, we did this with flashcards on physical pieces of paper. Nowadays, this is often done with flashcards on computer. But the basic idea is that you need to associate the graphic form with a sound and a meaning. And this is not a new process. This is, for example, exactly how Korean speakers have been learning and conceptualizing Chinese characters ever since they were first exposed to Chinese writing over 2,000 years ago on the Korean peninsula. They memorized the pronunciation of each character, obviously based on the pronunciation of Chinese at that time, and then filtered through Korean phonology. And they memorized the meanings, which were expressed by a Korean word that was deemed sufficiently close in meaning to the morpheme represented by the Chinese character. So in parallel to the chart I just showed you a few slides earlier, here are the same 6 characters, this time with their pronunciations. These are Chinese pronunciations as filtered through Korean and now in their modern Korean form, just for simplicity. And these are their meanings, but of course, for Korean speakers, the meanings are expressed by Korean words. So the number 10 I showed you earlier, here we have the Korean pronunciation of the Chinese pronunciation ship, and the meaning, the native Korean word yol, 10. And down here, this character, the second to last, the Korean pronunciation of the Chinese pronunciation, wol, and the native Korean word meaning moon as its meaning gloss, tal. And this is the way Chinese characters are labeled for Koreans. You label a Chinese character by giving its meaning and giving its pronunciation. So this Chinese character for moon is named tal wol, the character pronounced wol, which means moon. This is how ancient Korean scribes learned Chinese characters when the only way to read and write in Korea was to write in classical Chinese. Each character was memorized with a sound and a meaning. And this is simply not the way that people learn phonographic scripts as a second language. It's not how the Greeks learned Phoenician letters. It's not how the Etruscans learned Greek letters. It is simply not a method that is accessible with a phonographic script. So when Koreans first figured out how to write Korean, how to write their own language using Chinese characters, they did so by making two kinds of adaptations to the only writing system that they knew about, which was Chinese. They took the characters and either made a sound-based adaptation or a meaning-based adaptation in order to represent elements of spoken Korean language. So there were two results for how Chinese characters could end up being used. They could be used as phonograms by ignoring the meaning part and using them for their sound value only. So this character that we've seen before, talwol, could be used to write the Korean syllable wol any place it occurred. Or the sound value, the Chinese pronunciation, could be discarded, and the graph could be used to write an equivalent meaning Korean word, in which case it's functioning as a logogram in the vernacular writing system. So that's a situation in which talwol would be used to write specifically the word tal, meaning moon. Here's an early example of this kind of writing. This is a 9th century, very famous 9th century poem called the Song of Choyong. And if you are someone who knows Chinese, reads Mandarin, or reads classical Chinese, and you look at this text, you will not be able to make any sense of it whatsoever because it's in the old Korean language. And how does it work? Some of the Chinese characters are semantically adapted. Their Chinese pronunciation is ignored, and they are writing equivalent meaning morphemes in Korean. And that's typical of the noun and verb roots, the ones that have relatively concrete lexical meaning. And the characters in black are phonetically adapted. Their original Chinese meaning usage is ignored. Their Chinese pronunciation is used to represent similar sounding syllables or individual consonant sounds of Korean. Typically, we find this for the grammatical elements, the case marking particles, the verbal inflectional endings, and so on. I won't go over this poem in any detail. I do have one of several approximate Old Korean reconstructions up and a translation if you want to look at them later. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to move forward to talk about the implications of this kind of borrowing process for script typology, because this borrowing process that I've just outlined of semantic or phonetic adaptation of Chinese characters by people who learned Chinese characters as combinations of sound and meaning is not limited to the history of. We see it in Chinese characters to write Japanese and Korean. We see it to write Vietnamese and Duong. We see it to write Jurchen and Khitan. And going beyond the Sonographic sphere, we also see it in the borrowing of the Sumerian script to write Akkadian. So it's my claim that these processes, these methods of ignoring sound or ignoring meaning and adapting a character to represent elements of a different language based on their original sound aspect or their original meaning aspect are basically things that people do without thinking about it. They're simple, they're intuitive, they're universal when you have second language users, specifically of logographic writing systems. I promised you an example in Sumerian. So for example, the cuneiform sign that wrote the Sumerian word lugal for king gets borrowed into Akkadian to write the Akkadian word for king, ignoring the Sumerian pronunciation and just taking a translation equivalent in Akkadian. Similarly, the cuneiform sign that writes the Sumerian words for God and heaven gets borrowed to write the Akkadian words for God and heaven through semantic adaptation. There's also phonetic adaptation. So this graph can also be used to write an Akkadian syllable by ignoring its original Sumerian meaning. So logography matters. This is the argument I'm making, that the Chinese script as a whole has certain properties that in turn led people learning the script to assign a meaning and a sound value to every character, which in turn created the conditions in which this script could be borrowed in a particular way to write other languages. When the basic units of a writing system are logographic, as they are in Chinese, semantic adaptation is a natural, it's an automatic process. So the Chinese character that writes the word pronounced now in Mandarin as bo, meaning wave, gets used to write the Japanese word nami, meaning wave, as well as being used phonetically to write a syllable and ultimately develop into the kana graph that writes the syllable ha. And in parallel, the Sumerian sign that writes an, heaven, gets used to write the Akkadian word, meaning heaven, as well as being borrowed in Akkadian or Hittite or other writing systems that have borrowed cuneiform to write the syllable an. So we get this double function of graphs that is the direct result of those graphs being part of a logographic writing system. On the other hand, when basic units of a writing system are phonographic, this kind of semantic adaptation is completely precluded. So the Latin letter B is used to write the voiced bilabial stop or similar sounds in hundreds and hundreds of writing systems that have developed or been borrowed from Latin over 2 millennia, and it remains stubbornly phonographic. I'm not aware of any place where this graph has a logographic or morphographic function. Now, of course, within a phonographic writing system, there may be a few morphograms like the ampersand, and that can get borrowed and does get borrowed through semantic adaptation to write meaning equivalent words in other languages, such as the English word and. And it's precisely because the source writing systems are not logographic that we do not see semantic adaptation when Phoenician is adapted to write Greek, the source of the Greek alphabet, when Etruscan is adapted to write Latin, and so on and so forth, including the spread and adaptation of these two alphabets, Latin and Greek, to write hundreds of other languages. So it's my claim that given all of the historical examples of real-world borrowing of scripts, we see pathways of script borrowing, whether semantic adaptation is a widespread option in script borrowing, correlating with the logographic versus phonographic classification that was independently made simply based on looking at what kind of linguistic units are represented by the majority of graphs within a particular writing system. So we have a correlation of two features that do not depend on each other in their, let me phrase this a little better. These two aspects of the scripts can be observed independently, and a classification can be made based on them independently, but they correlate, and I think that's significant. It strongly suggests that the distinction between logographic and phonographic is not arbitrary. It's not just been imposed by linguists as a superficial method of classifying, but it reflects a meaningful difference in function and how scripts are actually used and manipulated in the real world by real people, what I think qualifies as a deep insight, to go back to the first slide in the presentation. Now, there is some counter evidence, and I want to mention it. It's always good to end a talk by casting doubt on the conclusions of your own talk. And this is something that came up earlier, actually, in the talk by Sven and Gordian. There does seem to be one major exception to what I'm proposing, which really tests the rule. And those are the heterograms, the Middle Iranian forms that are in Aramaic spelling, but represent and are read aloud as words in Middle Iranian languages. So, for example, the Middle Persian phrase Shahan Shah, King of Kings, can be represented graphically with a spelled Aramaic form, King of Kings, but we can tell from the grammatical affix that is Middle Persian, the N suffix, that this was pronounced as a Middle Persian word for king and not pronounced as something like Melech, the Aramaic word for king. So these heterograms seem to constitute what looks to me like a singular exceptional event of semantic adaptation of a phonographic script out of hundreds of historical borrowing events whereas semantic adaptation is typical when a logographic script is borrowed. And I actually think there are interesting historical explanations for why these heterograms have occurred. But I'm not an expert in this area, and I'm not going to speculate on that right now. So to conclude, it's been argued by some, such as Marshall Unger, that the categorical distinction between logographic and phonographic is a false dichotomy, and that imposing those categories on scripts essentializes them in a way that is misleading. But it seems to me that this correlation between categorizing writing systems as logographic or phonographic based on the linguistic units that graphs represent, and the pathways of borrowing that we see happening historically constitutes powerful evidence that there really is such a thing as a logographic writing system and a phonographic writing system. And that patterns of script borrowing are important real-world script functions or uses that should have a role to play in the way that we analyze, understand, and classify writing systems. And that these natural experiments that we can look at by looking at cases of historical script borrowing are a valuable source of information for grammatology. I recognize that today is in memory of Dominique Poutet, and that probably Yannis originally intended the last talk that we heard before mine to end the day, which would have been appropriate. I very much appreciate him slotting me in where my time zone in Seattle was workable for me. And I want to thank everyone else at the conference and welcome your comments and questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Well, in fact, your talk is not the last one. There is still another one after it.
Okay.
Yes. There are some questions. I have a very, very short one, which is probably trivial. You mentioned 9th century Korean that characters are used either phonographically or logographically. And this reminds me of Japanese on and kun. But my question is, a few decades ago, Chinese script was still used sometimes in Korean. What has remained, or Chinese characters that are still in use in Korean, are they rather phonographic or logographic?
Yes, thanks for that question. To the first point, briefly, these functions of Korean uses of Chinese characters are not only perfectly parallel to onyomi and kunyomi, but they actually have names in Korean of and hun that are in fact the same words as on and kun in Japanese. I should clarify that the kind of writing I'm talking about, early vernacular Korean writing using Chinese characters, died out in Korea. And that the use of Chinese characters that you see in the modern era of Korean is always for Sino-Korean borrowed Chinese vocabulary. So they are logograms that are not writing native Korean words. They're logograms writing borrowed Chinese morphemes. And so in fact, they have the borrowed Chinese pronunciation, and their meaning is the original, essentially the original Chinese meaning. So in that sense, they are very much like the onyomi of Japanese. So the modern Korean use of Chinese characters has been sort of a pure onyomi use. Mm-hmm. I hope that answers your question.
Yes. A question by Dan Harbour.
Hi. This is really compelling, and I really enjoyed the talk. I wanted to ask about heterograms, and you sort of half answered the question already. But I want to point to Sumerian Akkadian heterograms as well, because you do get the situation you see in China, Japan, China, Korea with simplex signs, but you also get Akkadian compound, Sumerian compound signs, some of which will have phonetic elements in them, being then borrowed wholesale. So like the Aramaic case, a whole word with phonetic components being transferred and then treated almost like treated logographically. It seems to me there's some kind of some kind of continuum. I don't think it undermines your point, but there's just a subtlety to how heterograms work in these in some systems.
Yes, that's a great point, and thank you. I do think this is a slightly different phenomenon. We actually see something similar in Japanese as well, where sometimes compound Chinese words written with two graphs get borrowed to write a native Japanese word in which you cannot assign any one of the Chinese graphs to any one component of the Japanese
word.
That
sounds exactly like it.
And that's very similar. And I do think that's different than the heterograms, because this is a case where the original writing system is conceptualized as logographic, and therefore there's already an idea that you can use a written form in Sumerian to write an equivalent meaning written form in Akkadian. That's kind of sort of built into the way the script borrowing has happened. And it's built into the way it's happened precisely because there are so many Sumerian logograms in the first place that have been semantically adapted. And so I think it's really a kind of different phenomenon than purely phonographic writing getting adapted in this interesting way. And I'm actually curious about whether you're using the term heterogram just casually, or if people in Assyriology actually call these heterograms.
No, completely casually.
Yeah, okay, because I think we want to reserve heterogram for this very specific type of borrowing that we see in Middle Iranian languages. And as far as I know, it's only used for that particular type of borrowing. Thank you, Dan.
Question from Fritjof.
Yes, thank you for this great talk. It was really interesting, and like whenever anyone reads something about, you know, writing, this question of like logograms and like what is it not, and what does it stand for always comes up. So this was really insightful. But when you wrote that, for example, B is like stubbornly phonographic, I immediately thought of, I also wrote it in the chat. I immediately thought of examples like beyond borrowing and beyond like standardized writing, but for example, when what's now known as like outdated text message English, for example, B4 is like the letter B with the numeral 4, or he be working with just written as a B, or even an entire phrase like see you. Couldn't those things be analyzed as, I mean, of course it is based in like how that sounds, but couldn't those also be analyzed as logographic in that sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. And I think all writing systems can be manipulated in all kinds of ways in a kind of ludic or playful context, and that people constantly play and manipulate with written graphs in all kinds of clever ways, including the uses of letters that you've talked about. But that's different from a script borrowing process in which people are learning how an entire script functions and then adapting it to write another language. And while that kind of ludic play can play a small role in that, and certainly has, for example, in the history of the development of Japanese writing, I do think that kind of playful manipulation of graphs does not correlate in any meaningful way with these broader patterns of script borrowing that we see. But I agree that it is a good point that actually there's nothing to theoretically prevent anyone from using the letter B as a logogram, or the letter C and U as logograms. It can happen, and it does happen. But I'm not aware of any instance of borrowing of the Latin script to write a language it had not previously written, in which letters are used as logograms in that way. And that would be the kind of information that I think would be very interesting counter evidence to what I'm arguing.
Thank you for your answer. I mean, yes, the extent is like very much different, but thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Question by Amalia.
Yes, hi. I really enjoyed your talk, and I find it very convincing, although actually you didn't need to convince me, because one of my pet peeves is people who insist that the Chinese writing system is syllabic. But anyway, I was interested though in your mentioning of the heterograms, and it struck me that there's a very tiny similar process that happens quite frequently when the Arabic script is borrowed. And that is that Arabic, the language, the spoken language, has a lot of phonemic distinctions that the languages that borrow the script don't use. And so in Pashto, for example, there are 4 ways, I believe, of spelling the phoneme S. And so Arabic words, etymologically Arabic words, will retain their Arabic spelling. Mm. And so there are lots of letters that map onto one sound, and then of course they had to go and create more letters to write the other phonemes that they don't share with Arabic. But that means that the spelling of a word contains information about that word that is independent of the phonology of the word in the language. And so you can almost see it as a kind of determinative or something, because it's telling you information about the origin and the etymology of the word. And this doesn't in any tiny way, this is not contra what you're saying in any way. It's just it may be that the heterograms are actually on a very large continuum. Just
thank you for
wondering
that.
what you might think about that.
Mm-hmm. I think what you're describing is not like the heterograms, in which in the heterogram there is no relationship between the individual graphs of the written word and the way the word is pronounced. What you're describing is a common phenomenon for orthographically deep phonographic written languages, and English is the same. So the words we have that come from Latin or French or Greek, or in fact borrowed from other languages, often are spelled in atypical ways. That reflect
although we don't use otherwise useless letters for it, but yes.
Well, we do. I mean, we have K's and C's, both writing K, and we have, and for example, you take a word like electricity, which is written with electric plus ity, and the C is there in both electric and electricity, and it writes a K sound in the first and a S sound in the second, and it preserves the morphological aspect, right? When you add ity, morphophonemically, you change electric to electris, but the spelling doesn't change. That contains etymological information. Now, this is exactly why Unger said English is on the continuum toward logography. But it's really a different kind of, it's really a way of, it is a historically conditioned phenomenon that results in homophones being represented distinctly in the written language, but in a way that is still very much connected to letters having phonetic values. It's just they have a range of phonetic values. And some of that comes from borrowing, some of that comes from sound change. There are all kinds of reasons for it that produce these orthographically deep phonographic writing systems. But those writing systems still will not get borrowed logographically if they ever get adapted to write another language. They're still fundamentally phonographic in their character, I would argue.
I would agree with you. My point is more that there is some, they don't remain pure phonograms because they do carry some other information along with them.
Yes, I don't disagree with that. And I think that's an area in which we still, I think, don't have a lot of deep understanding. I mean, how much information does an English speaker get from the fact that write, there's a W-R-I-T-E and there's an R-I-G-H-T? I think most English speakers aren't aware that those represent sounds that used to exist in the language. I think they feel like just purely arbitrary distinctions, but they do correlate with different morphemes, and they are in some sense, some people would say that's a logographic aspect of the writing system, and other people would just say it's orthographically deep. There is no one-to-one correspondence of letter and sound, but there are lots of different regular patterns of correspondence that speakers have to learn when they become literate. And I think that's a fascinating area for further investigation. Thank you.
And a question by Keisuke Honda.
You're muted.
Okay. I'm very sorry, I did it again. Yeah, thank you so much for the very insightful talk. And just one question. Do we have a good ground to assume that the historical process of adaptation justifies the synchronic typological status of a script in the borrowing writing system? So for example, Japanese borrowed Chinese characters and they use it in their own system today. Do we still can we still believe that the kanji characters function logographically in today's Japanese?
I don't think we can make that assumption. You know, scripts develop and change on their own after they've been adapted to write another language. They then have an independent history. Mm-hmm. So I think you have to make that judgment on the merits of how the system works synchronically, mm-hmm. which I know is the work you've been doing. You may get some insights from the history, may help you understand why the script has ended up where it has, but no, I don't think you can make an assumption that the historical borrowing process automatically tells you how you should be classifying the script hundreds or thousands of years later.
Mm-hmm. All right, yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And comments by Cornelia, which has microphone problems. To my knowledge, when the characters were borrowed, the recipient cultures adapted them to their use over time by exchanging phonetic components to make the result fit their own language better. And they created new characters that are unknown in China, sometimes of the significant phonetic type. So we shouldn't talk about Chinese characters anymore, since the resulting signery is already modified to fit the recipient language. The Chinese also adapted a selection of characters and constructed new characters to have a better fit between language and writing. Characters fell out of use because they no longer had good fit with the word or the same meaning. Phonetic components were exchanged for better fitting ones and so forth. So maybe you would like to comment on this?
Yes, thank you. That's a really good question. So absolutely, writing system, Chinese character writing system within China, like all writing systems in the pre-modern era, as far as I know, is fluid and variable and changeable. New characters were created, characters were written in different ways. There was lots of variation until you get modern era standardization of scripts. And you're absolutely right that in all the languages that borrowed the Chinese character script, in addition to adapting the existing Chinese characters, they all created additional graphs based on the Chinese character structural model. And in my work, I call those sonograms to distinguish them from Chinese characters actually used in writing Chinese. The best known example is Vietnamese, where all of the Chunong characters, many were created out of Chinese character components, but in novel combinations that don't exist in Chinese writing itself. So that's absolutely correct that all of these changes have taken place both within the history of the Chinese writing system and its adaptation to other writing systems. I don't think that bears in any particular way on the main argument I'm trying to make, but it is absolutely an important part of the story that I left out of my talk for time reasons.
Thank you very much, Zeb, for that very interesting talk and for all these answers to questions. Thank you.
Thank you.